Hey, tonight we're going to be talking about the real estate purchase contract. I'm really excited to be here. Welcome to our class. This is very important for the test, but it's also very important for your whole career in real estate, because what happens is that the filling in the blanks of these state approved or association approved forms is considered a limited practice of law. And so because it's very necessary for our business. And so this does get tested on a lot. In fact, in the Utah law portion of the test, there will be a real estate purchase contract on screen that you can refer to. And then you'll be asked questions about that. You know, was this included? Was this not included? What happened if someone missed it? You know, what was the deadline? All those kind of questions. So do not neglect your study of the real estate purchase contract. And this little review we're going to do tonight should prove very helpful to you. But I would really admonish you to read the real estate purchase contract at least 3 times, you know, and or 4, you know, I mean, you need to be familiar with it. And as we go through it in this particular class, I'll refer to some of those things. So with us tonight again, as usual, is Mr. Dan Naylor, our host with the most, and he will be our technical advisor and will also maybe chime in once in a while.
Hey, happy to be here.
Keep me on the straight and narrow path here, and appropriate for Utah. But anyway, let's dive right in. Start with our very first comments here. And one of the things, like I just mentioned, is that in the real estate purchase contract, our state approved form is 6 pages. And, you know, different states have their own contract and things that they think that are important. When I first came here to Utah, I think we only had a 4-page contract. So we keep expanding it and changing things. And, you know, we have a contract review committee, and the commissioners are very tuned in to how important this is. And they're always trying to modify maybe the tone of the contract or include things in it that, you know, they see that are more necessary or are forestalling a problem that, you know, that they see when they bring people in for disciplinary sanctions. So the first question that might be asked is who can create a new contract? And as a licensee, like I said, you are granted by a license by the state of Utah, and this license allows you to complete these forms. Now, it is viewed as a limited practice of law, but don't let that go to your head. I mean, we have forms for many of the eventualities that you're going to run into in real estate, and then we have addendums for those forms. And as a licensed agent, you can fill out these forms. Now, can a buyer, for example, insist that you use a different contract than the state approved form? And the answer to that is yes. And you can fill out that form too. But the best example of that would be a builder's contract. Now, we do have a real estate purchase contract for new construction, but most builders do not use that. They have their own custom form, particularly if you're a larger builder, that really kind of favors them more than our state approved form does. But you can fill in the blanks on those forms because the buyer insisted that you do that. Now, if your broker came to you, or if maybe you went to a, you know, how to get rich in real estate or create a real estate class, and they said, well, here's a 2-page agreement that we like to use. And if as an agent, you recommended to a buyer that, hey, let's use this 2-page form, you can't do that. Now, if they said to you, I want to use this 2-page form, then you could do it. But the recommendation has to come, or the request has to come from them. So who can create a new contract? Well, you can, but the word create might be a little bit rough here. Who can fill out the form? What that means is who can fill out the blanks in a pre-approved form, okay? And I recommend, of course, that you use the state approved form. And in very rare cases would you ever modify from that. Now, you know, I mentioned new construction, and of course, if you're doing commercial real estate, we have some commercial forms as well. If you're doing commercial leasing, then that's kind of interesting. We fill out a form that's readily available called the intent to lease. And then that once that happens, they take that back to the lawyers. I mean, the landlord has his lawyers and the tenants have their lawyers, particularly if you're looking at some larger commercial spaces. And they take, well, this is our standard form. And they say, well, this is my standard form. And then they kind of create a new standard between merging those forms together. Or sometimes they just accept the landlord's form if they're a smaller tenant. But you're not going to be doing that. It's going to be their lawyers, or perhaps it might be the landlord on lease agreements. Okay, now sometimes you have to modify a form. Okay, and for example, you might have to put something specific in it. There's a lot of blanks in this form that allow you to do different things, and like address issues, like the personal property that's included or not included. But sometimes there's some other specific things they want to include it in there. And how we modify a REPC is with an addendum. We have an addendum that attaches to the contract. Every addendum has to have a number on it. Some addendums have a specific purpose for them. Like, there could be a lead-based paint addendum. There could also be an addendum to have the title company hold the earnest money. These are specific uses of an addendum that's already pre-printed out for you. But that's how we modify a contract. We modify a contract with an addendum. Okay. Now the addendum form also has another purpose, and that's called, you can check addendum or you can check on it counter proposal. So if an offer came in and you took it to your seller and the seller looked at it and he said, well, I won't do that, but I will do this, you could counter that offer back with a counter offer, which really is the addendum form where you've checked the counter offer blank. And then of course you fill out all the forms. They have their places where you have to initial on them and sign and whatnot. And then that creates the binding agreement between the two parties. And we'll go through that a little bit more. Dan, I think we have another comment on the next slide. How can an agent modify a REPC? Great, thank you. Now in the REPC contract, there's also a section in there. Now sometimes I'll call it paragraph 5 or section 5, but there's a paragraph in there, a section in there that identifies the brokerages, and it identifies whom they are representing, and it also identifies their licenses numbers. So if you're working for a broker that is just a broker, an individual, a breather with a license, and you're working under that broker's name would be there, and then it would have his or her number, and then your name, and then your number, and then whether you're representing the buyer and seller or both at the same time. And then if your broker is an entity, which most brokers are, where they actually have a company license that's issued to an LLC or perhaps a corporation, whatever entity they wanted to use, Massachusetts Business Trust, whatever it is they wanted to get out there in the marketplace and do that that's a non-breather, then that will have a company license number as well. Okay, so why do we have that in the form? Because the section is the confirmation of agency disclosure. And we have a class, of course, on agency and whatnot, but that paragraph confirms what the roles of all the agents are. And it's interesting when I teach the 12-hour new agent class, we hit this a lot. We talk about every specific form that you need to do a certain type of transaction, and we go through those forms and we talk about them. But one of the questions I bring up with my students often is, why do we have in the form where you're confirming the agency? Well, quite frankly, we don't have an agency disclosure form that I'm real happy with in the state. We have paragraphs in our buyer's agreement, and we have a paragraph in our listing contract that we use with sellers where we do discuss agency. But agents get confused. You see, you cannot do an agency disclosure when you list the buyer to work with them as a buyer representative, or when you list the house and put it on the MLS for sale, where you'll be working for the seller. Because you really don't know what all the roles of the agents are going to be until you actually get the offer. And so you might receive 3 different offers on a house, and in one offer, it was actually written by someone in your office. So you have a broker with 2 agents that are working underneath that broker, and they both work for the same broker. Or they could be from different offices, but owned by the same broker. You know, oh, you're from the Sandy office? Yeah, I'm from the Sugar House office, but it's the same company. So in that case, the broker will be a limited agent, being fair and honest to both parties. And the agent from the one office will be representing the buyer, and the agent from the other office will be representing the seller as a designated agent. But you really wouldn't know that until the offer was written. You could have another offer that came in at the same time from another company. So you and your broker would be representing the seller only, and the buyers are represented by that other brokerage firm and perhaps another sales agent in that brokerage. Or, so those are a couple different ways that it could actually happen. Or what if it's your own offer? What if you had a buyer? And this is why you listed this house, because you had a buyer that was looking for a house in that particular area. So you went out door knocking and prospecting in that area to find a house for your buyer. And perhaps you found it for sale by owner, or perhaps you found another individual, but they're willing to sign a listing contract with you. And so now you have that house and the seller listed as a client of yours, and you have an agency responsibility to them. But you also have an agency responsibility to the buyer that you've been working with. And maybe this was a buyer who really the relationship goes back a step even further than that. They had a house for sale in another area in the valley. You put it up for sale, and that's under contract. And now you've taken that seller and you're trying to find a new house for them to buy. Man, I love chain transactions like that. You can get 3 or 4 commissions sometimes lined up in one fell swoop. It's really nice. It makes for a very nice month. And you get to help a lot of people. But in that case, if you're on both sides of the contract, we call the buyer side and the seller side, then what happens is your broker and you will have to be limited agents, because you'll have to be working for the seller and for the buyer, being fair and honest to everyone. So you really don't know what the roles of the agents are going to be until the offers come. And so you can have an agency discussion with your clients prior to that, of course, and you should, but you really can't do a disclosure because you don't know what the roles of the agents are going to be yet. And there's another click of the button there on this particular slide, Dan. So we are confirming in the REPC what the agency is, but you should have had an agency disclosure, or at least a discussion, prior to that confirmation. So it doesn't just come out of the blue, okay? All righty then, let's look at an example REPC. Now, there is a link on the invitation that Dan sent out tonight that many of you saw. Or if you're just finding this class online, there'll be another spot in the class material where you can download the sample REPC contract. And you need to do that. Why? Because it is filled out, and it's not just a form with the blanks. And so there'll be this is the way you're going to see it on the exam. When you go in and take the Utah law test, there's going to be a REPC contract, and it's going to be filled out. And in that real estate purchase or REPC contract, it's going to have all the particulars for that particular transaction. You know, what's included, what's not included, what the sales price is, how much the earnest money is, how quickly it has to be deposited. You know, all the details of this transaction are going to be in that 6-page contract with the addendums. Okay. So let's talk about some of the details. So if you saw a question that said, how much is the estimated loan amount to the buyer, you could find this in the real estate purchase contract in section 2.1. And we can highlight that 2.1 right here. And you see 2 is the purchase contract, but 2.1c where that arrow is, shows you that in this particular transaction, they're trying to get a loan of several $100,000 here. And so what they might ask you on the exam is they say, this particular buyer is buying the home, and what is the loan amount that they're trying to acquire in order to buy this home? And you would find it there. Now, I wanted to throw in a caveat here, and we're not going to flip to it. We'll actually get there in just a moment. But the caveat is that, remember, we have that counteroffer or addendum form. And it might be that this whole section here needed to be changed because they offered, I think it was $200,000 or $340,000. The seller said, "Oh, I won't do 340, but I would do 345." And so they countered back to the buyer and said, "Won't do 340, but we'll do 345." And the buyer accepted that. And so there will be an addendum, which will be check counter offer. And that addendum will change the sales price. So when you're taking the exam, and you come to this particular section, what I suggest you do is kind of peruse through these 6 pages plus whatever other addendums they have attached to this contract. And it could add another 1 or 2 pages, sometimes even more. I had one I just closed on, well, it got recorded today, that had 5 addendums. So, it's kind of interesting, but sometimes there are little things that have to be addressed. Well, another one that's quite common that might be attached to a contract is if the title company is holding the earnest money instead of the brokerage firm. So, these are questions you're going to have to look at. So look through the contract, read it through. I mean, you have 40 questions on the state test, on the Utah law test, and the state, what we call the state test. Okay. But probably, how many would you say, Dan? 4 or 5, perhaps, would be on the REPC contract?
Yeah, about that many. It's about 16 questions on the whole agency section, and the REPC is part of that. So yeah, like 4 or 5 questions.
So don't fret on this. If you have read a blank one, or if you even take this filled out one and read it 3 or 4 times, and plus you of course read the counter offers and addendums, you'll be well prepared. I mean, you'll understand it, because you'll know that, okay, the money is handled on this first page here, and you'll find, okay, on page 6 is where we have all the deadlines. Okay, you'll be familiar with the form, and that will put you at ease quite a bit, because yeah, it is a lot of things but you don't have to read every single word. I mean, you need to do that when you're studying, but the main gist of the questions, well, we'll go through some here in just a moment. We already did. How much is the new loan that they want to get? Okay, so that would be an example of that type of question. And remember, it will still be a multiple choice question, A, B, C, or D. One of those 4 will be correct. So it's kind of like they're giving you a crib sheet. The answers are on this form. So just breathe and work through it, and you'll be okay. Let's go to page 2, please, on our example REPC. Thank you, Dan. Now, who's responsible for capital improvements? And if you go to the REPC contract, if we pull that up, Dan, please, and let's go ahead and highlight it. That's where it is. Okay, so it's right up there, and okay, so it's assessments. Yeah, so we're really looking at section 4 here, and it says prorations, assessments, and other payment obligations. Okay, so a special assessment, as you remember from your study, particularly in the vocab, is where the city or the county has come in, or maybe it's an improvement district like a irrigation district, or maybe it's a sewer district or water district. But some governmental entity has come in and said, we're going to repave the streets, or we're going to put in new sidewalks and curb and gutter or whatever. And they figure out how much each homeowner needs to pay based on their amount of frontage that they have on the lot, if it's a street. If it's something like a pipe or something you're putting in or some other type of improvement, they may go just by the numbers, but a lot of this stuff is street improvements and that sort of thing. And so if they're repaving or they're putting in curb and gutter. And so what happens is if you had a corner lot, you're going to pay more than the guy that didn't have a corner lot because you have more frontage, you know. But they're going to figure out what that is and what your share of the improvement will cost for the special assessment. Now, there's some rules here. One of them is that your share of the special assessment, let's say it was $4,000, needs to increase the value of your property at least to $4,000. If you can argue that, you know, you spent $9,000, and I understand, you know, that you ran into some trouble with this or that or the other thing, but, and I know costs are high right now, but on the other hand, my house didn't increase $9,000. You can, you know, neighbor can actually get together and challenge that and say, you know, we had an appraiser come in, they did an evaluation, and we only had maybe a $5,000 to $6,000 increase, and then and you can, if you're very persuasive and successful, you could persuade the district or the entity that they have to eat the difference. They overpaid. You know, it's supposed to improve the property on whatever your special assessment was, but they give you an opportunity to pay it all now. You know, here's your share, just send us a check. Or sometimes they give you the opportunity to pay it over a series of years, let's say 4 or 5 years or something. So this particular seller decided to pay it over, you know, in an annual installment, and they just add it to your property tax. And so what happens is 2 years later, they're selling your property. There's still 4 years left to, or maybe 3, to pay off that special assessment. So when I first moved to this state, our contracts didn't address this issue. You know, I came from Colorado. I was a broker in Colorado for a few years before I came to Utah. And we always addressed it. And so when I came here and it wasn't even addressed, well, what happened is that buyers would buy a property and they would, you know, and the agents didn't even think about this, but what happens is they would buy the property, protect that individual who was paying on the payment plan, and they would have to take over those payments. And it was never addressed or disclosed to that buyer, you know, and which I thought was totally unfair, and would voice my opinion quite vigorously from time to time. And so when we did a contract rewrite, we put it in because, you know, the commissioners are very keen to making sure that these contracts are fair for both parties. Now, another thing that's interesting is that the contract we have today, when you read through it, you're going to say, wow, this is really buyer favored or buyer oriented. You know, the buyer can walk away for any number of things and get all their money back if, as long as they comply with the deadlines. But, you know, it doesn't really protect the seller near as much as it protects the buyer. And the market sways back and forth. We're currently starting into another shift where we might be a little bit more seller protective. I don't know. But when we rewrite these contracts every few years, you know, it's also based a little bit on the market conditions that are existing in the market at that time. And these forms were done at a time when, you know, we needed to protect the buyers quite a bit. We've been in such a severe seller's market, though. I think they've enjoyed the protection, you know, because the sellers, you know, they're getting them over what they were asking and whatever. But, you know, the market's changing, and I'm excited. I've always made more money in down markets. And I didn't like all these bidding wars we've had. And the one I closed today, there was no bidding war. We did offer them full price, but we did also get a concession of $5,000 where the seller paid some of the buyer's closing costs, which we haven't seen for a while. Well, we asked for it and they gave it, which we were happy to get. And then it appraised for more than what we paid for it too. So, you know, we haven't seen that in the market for a while, but we're going to see more of that. Buyer's market, seller's market. Come on, guys, it really doesn't matter. It's always a realtor's market. It just depends on where you're focusing and what you're, you know, and where that you can find the most success. And there's some exciting things happening on both those arenas, whether you like to work with buyers, sellers, or both. You know, so anyway, what we're looking at here in this capital improvement section, if you have a contract in front of you, is the question is, who's responsible for paying for the capital improvements? So let's look at it. I mean, this section 4, the 4.1 talks about prorations. Now, that's not what we need to read, but proration is that there are many costs that are continuing, property tax being one of them, where that's not going to be paid off. And sometimes if your buyer's purchasing a owner occupied property, you don't have to worry about a rental or renter agreement. But sometimes if they are purchasing a rental property that's already occupied, then that renter has the right to stay there unless it was restricted in their agreement, which it usually is not. And maybe your buyer is very desirous of having that renter stay there because they're buying it as an income property, like a duplex or fourplex, triplex, that kind of thing. And so you don't want to have an empty building right after you buy it. So you want the tenants to stay there and honor the agreement. That agreement endures. Well, then we have to handle some prorations. Well, what about the rent? So if rents are paid in advance, okay? So in a few days, we'll be in September, and a tenant would have paid their whole September rent up front. But if they sold that property September 10th, the current owner who owned it prior, from the 1st through the 10th, they're entitled to that 10 days worth of rent because it was their property. But on the 11th, it's somebody else's property. It's the buyer's property. But wait a minute, that rent was paid in advance. So the seller should give up that portion for the remaining month to the buyer. And also we have to deal with the deposit. Someday that renter's going to move out of there and they're going to want their deposit back. So these are samples of prorations, and rents and taxes, those types of things. Okay. And then in 4.2 in this section 4, it says special assessments. And I'm going to read it. It says any assessments for capital improvements as approved by the Homeowners Association, HOA, pursuant to the HOA governing documents, or as assessed by a municipality or special improvement district prior to the settlement deadline, shall be paid for by whom? Well, if it's that street improvement that he had the opportunity to pay it off 2 years ago, but he didn't, maybe it ought to be paid by the seller. In this particular example you have in front of you, if you're using the one that was attached to this class, it is check seller. The seller needs to pay that off. I mean, they should have paid it off 2 years ago, so maybe they didn't want to. Maybe they were tight for money, or maybe they just decided to do it on a payment plan, which is fine. Because that was offered to them by the municipality or the improvement district or whatever. Now, but you could also check buyer or split equally between the buyer and seller. So I don't know. I've always felt that when a buyer goes out and looks at a property, he says, "Oh, wow, this is nice. It has a fire hydrant in front. That would be cool if the house ever started to burn. It has street lights. I like those. I like curb and gutter. Has a nice sidewalk so we can walk our dogs in the neighborhood and whatnot. That's all cool." And he takes that into consideration. I'd like to offer this much for that house. But if he finds out later that some of those things he's offering that much for are not paid for, well, then maybe the seller ought to pay for it. Or maybe they shouldn't. It's all a negotiable item. Okay, it all depends on how you look at it. But if I'm representing a buyer, I'm always going to check what? Seller. Unless I know that it's going to be a real deal killer, and then I might want to split it. Okay. And there's other things like escrow fees and rental deposits and prepaid rents, which I've already illustrated. And then we have the whole issue of HOAs. And sometimes HOAs have they all have continuing fees, but they also occasionally have a community transfer fee, which you're going to have to address and handle that. I mean, where, okay, you're selling your house to this new person, well, they have to make an application fee here at our homeowner association. Now, not in Utah, but back east in New York and other areas, sometimes your buyer has to be approved by the HOA. I haven't seen it too many in Utah that actually require that, where you have to be approved by the HOA to buy that house, but it's very common back east. Utility services, and sometimes you hold proceeds from the sale You withhold things for judgments and trust deeds and mortgages to be paid off and whatnot. Okay, so that's section 4.3. Now you see why you need to be familiar with this form. And the nice thing is that when you are there and you're under a lot of pressure to get through the test, each one of these sections has a title which tells you what's in it. And they are of a bolder print, and they're usually in all caps. So you can flip through pretty quickly and find the section you're looking for, but I would much rather that, of course, you were familiar where it was to begin with. In fact, if you glance down on this form, you see that section 5, which has the agents and the brokerages and their licenses numbers, as I mentioned earlier. Okay, let's go to the next page, please. Okay, now these deadlines can be really important, and because it's something they really like to kind of test on. Okay, and so what happens is, let's go back to let's go ahead and click up the form, Dan, and we're going to go back to the first page. Oh, and actually we have an addendum to look at here. Okay, so what we have here is the seller decides on December 16th that they can't find a new home. Can they cancel the contract? Now, they can if they provided for it in the agreement. So we have an addendum here, and what happens is back. There it is. Okay. We have an addendum that covers this in great detail, and it's addendum number 1. And actually, if you look at this, you'll see, let's go ahead and highlight that. Well, it's not going to highlight. Okay, on this addendum, it's addendum number 1. And as I stated, every addendum has to have a number. And so the underwriter can say, well, is there anything else in this contract? Because I have addendum 1, 3, 4, and 5, but I don't have an addendum 2. So, they want to know what happened to it and what it says, because that's one of the ways they evaluate the property for a loan and whatnot. So what happens here is this property is subject to, and this printing is already in the contract. Okay, this is subject to the buyer finding and or putting under contract a new residence for them to move into. So it's 1.1. It says subject to seller acquiring a new residence. The seller's obligation to sell the property is conditioned upon the seller signing a contract to purchase another residence, the replacement residence, by 5 p.m. Mountain Standard Time on the 14th day of December. Okay. Let's look at seller 1.2 and the right to cancel. Now let's look at this very carefully when I read it. If the seller is not contract for the purchase of a replacement residence by the replacement contract deadline. So this is a seller right, isn't it? Buyer or seller, either one, may within 3 calendar days after the replacement contract deadline cancel the REPC by providing written notice to the other party. And if that cancellation notice is given, the earnest money deposit shall be released to the buyer. So the buyer gets their earnest money back. The seller, however, may remove this condition any time prior to the replacement contract deadline by providing written notice to the buyer. Maybe they say, well, we can't find a house, but we're just going to move in with our in-laws, or we're going to move into an apartment. So they can still continue with the sale. But, the seller says, I can't find another house. I have nowhere to go, and I don't want to sell you my house anymore because I can't find another house to buy. Well, that would be unfair to keep the buyer's money, wouldn't it? Right, Dan?
Yep, that's right.
Yeah, yep. Just wouldn't be fair. Even though the buyer may have spent some money doing some investigation of the property, I guess that, and that's at their risk. Okay, now let's drop down in this addendum, because there's another thing in here that's kind of interesting. It says buyer and seller agree that the contract deadline referenced in 24 of the real estate purchase contract remain unchanged or are changed. Yeah, they changed the settlement deadline to January 31st. Now, go to the very last page of the real estate purchase contract, okay, and look at section 24. The one you haven't, that you're referring to. And it says the settlement deadline here was January 17th, 2019. But they changed it to January 31st. So devious exam writer may very well write a question saying, what is the settlement deadline that the buyer and seller have agreed to? Okay. And so if you just go to page 6 and read, oh, there it is, settlement deadline, January 17th, there'll be January 17th as an answer, but it will be the wrong answer, because as an additional item on this addendum, they changed that deadline to January 31st. That's why really pay attention to these addendums, because it can change deadlines in the contract. It can change how much they're paying for the home. It can change how much earnest money, it can change a lot of different things. This particular addendum addresses the seller getting a new house, but they also slipped in that they're going to change that settlement deadline as well. So watch for that, because that could cost you another exam fee. So be very careful there. Okay. All righty then. We are
Got a couple more questions to look at.
Yeah, we are on page 4 of our questions now. All right. If the buyer cancels on 1/9/2019 because they can't find, can't get financing, what happens? Now, let's look real quick back at that section 24 again. When is our financing and appraisal deadline? Well, it's January 7th. Well, this is January 9th. Okay. So what happens here, boys and girls? Unless there's another addendum that extended that deadline, which I don't see one. So it's 1/9 is past that deadline. So they can't cancel based on financing and appraisal. Okay. So let's look at, let's say they, so what happens? Well, the buyer could lose their earnest money if they don't go ahead and close, by the original settlement deadline, or the one they extended it to, which was, the 31st on this one, January 31st. So let's look at on page 4. Let's look at financing conditions. Okay. All right, so I'm on page 4 of the real estate purchase contract. I'm looking at section 8.3, which is called financing condition. Now, had they canceled within the deadline, what would have happened? Well, it says financing is required. B, and it's checked X. Buyer's obligation to purchase is conditioned upon buyer obtaining the loan referenced in section 2.1. That was that on the first page, where this is how much we want to pay, and here's the type of loan we're looking for, or at least the amount. And what we're looking at here is the loan reference in section 2.1, that this condition is referred to as a financing condition if checked. Sections 8.3, B, Roman numeral I and II and III apply, otherwise they do not. Okay, so I says buyer's right to cancel before the financing and appraisal deadline if the buyer, in the buyer's sole discretion, is not satisfied with the terms and condition of the loan. That's really broad. We could be in a 4% market and the lender offered them a 3% loan, says, I still don't like it, and they don't even have to tell you what it is specifically they don't like. They just say, I'm not happy with the loan financing, and then cancel the deal and get their money back and walk away. Unless it's filled out the way this one is. It says by providing written notice seller no later than the deadline. Okay, whereupon $2,000 of the buyer's earnest money shall be released to the seller without requirement of further written authorization from the buyer. Okay, now that's the whole entire earnest money. So this particular buyer, in order to make their offer more enticing to a seller to accept, has gone into the deal saying that even if I don't like the financing, I can get out of the deal, but I'm going to leave the $2,000 for the seller. And a lot of sellers, if this is the only one that offered that, if they're looking at, well, all these offers are very similar, they're offering about the same price and whatnot. But look at this guy. This guy says that even if he cancels the deal because the appraisal comes back and won't work, or they don't like it, or the financing comes back and it won't work for them, or they don't like it, they're going to walk away. I'm going to lose the sale, but at least I get the $2,000. Well, that's kind of enticing for a seller to accept that particular offer. It's one of the ways to, maybe get your offer accepted. Okay, and then it goes on to say earnest money deposits released to the seller. If the REPC is canceled as provided in 8.3 B and I, the seller agrees that all the buyer's earnest money deposit or deposits, if applicable, shall be released to the seller without requirement of further written authorization by the buyer. So, there is some teeth in here that the seller can depend on. And then you go down to 8.4. Here's an opportunity if you want to provide additional earnest money. And this one, it is checked will, and they're going to bring in after this deadline, provided section to deliver the buyer's brokerage is additional earnest money of another $1,000. So, once they get down the road here a little bit, they're going to ante up another $1,000, which is kind of interesting. This is very common in commercial transactions where we have some of their earnest money go hard and they're going to leave it on the table. And that's what they're offering here. They're going to give it all to them, but they are going to bring in another $1,000 if they continue to keep going. So anyway, that's little tips on, things you might want to consider, not necessarily for the test, but for making your offers more appealing. Okay, so let's do 8.3. We did that. Okay, I think we can go to the next one. Now, here's an interesting question. Are solar panels included in the sale? Well, all this personal property stuff is really on the first page. So let's go back to the first page and let's take a look and see what we have here. And on the first page, it says included items. Unless excluded herein, the sale includes the following items if presently owned and in place on the property: plumbing, heating, air conditioning, fixtures and equipment, solar panels. It's printed right there in the contract, solar panels. Ranges, range hoods, cooktops, dishwashers, ceiling fan, water heaters, water softeners, light fixtures, and you cheapskate, the bulbs. Bathroom fixtures. I had one guy take all those bulbs. I called him up and said, what the heck? The buyer said there's only one bulb in the property. What's going on? Well, I just put all those new bulbs in, like you said, to make the property look brighter, and bring them back. You cheapskate. Bring them back. You've got them probably in a bag. They're all going to get broken anyway. Just bring them back. Okay, bathroom fixtures, bathroom mirrors, all windows coverings, including curtains, draperies, window blinds, shutters. You should have a familiarity with this, right? Now, here's another tip, not for the test, but for practical application. When you get one of your houses sold and you're representing the seller, it would be smart to bring them a copy of their agreement that they entered into with the buyer and highlight this section showing what things they agreed to leave with the property. Now, if you look down here, there's other included items, and they've checked refrigerator and microwaves, so they're going to leave those. But if you look down under 1.3, it says excluded items, draperies on the main floor and the playhouse. Okay. So sometimes in multiple offers that came in and maybe a deal fell through and now we're online with the new buyer and the new deal, they get confused. And you don't want them leaving things they should have taken, like the playhouse and the draperies on the main floor. But if they had not specified that those would be excluded and that the sellers would take them with them, then they would a lot of the stuff would be included with the with the sale on the home, and therefore there's going to be no confusion because you dropped by and gave them a list, or at least gave them this part of the contract highlighted. And that's a really good thing to do, because people get confused over which deal it was. And well, I didn't know that was included, and it's going to save a lot of trouble and heartache later. Okay, on included items. So that's where you find it. So are the solar panels included in the sale? Well, number one, they're not excluded. And number two, it's printed in the contract. And things like awnings, satellite dishes, installed TV antenna in the brackets on the wall, ceiling mounted speakers, I mean, you can't take the carpeting. You have to leave the garage door open or in the transmitters, security systems. A lot of people, it's very popular to put in some pretty nice security systems. And if they don't take them out, before the sale, or they don't exclude them specifically, they get left in. And look, in any landscaping, I had one couple that wanted to dig up their tree. And I said, no, you can't take the tree. Well, we planted that tree for little Johnny, and and we want to take it to our new house so we can continue to have it. Why don't you buy him a new tree? But a bigger one, because he's bigger now. Then we talked him out of it, but they were honestly thinking about digging up the tree, if you can believe it. That's why, dropping by and having a conversation with them might not be a bad idea. But for the test, that's a really good one to think about. Solar panels are included unless they were specifically excluded, which they were not. Okay, let's go to the next addendum piece. Thank you. If the settlement happens on the 18th, who is in breach of contract? Now, on this addendum, remember, we extended the deadline. Yeah, where's my addendum? There it should be. And remember, we excluded it till the January 31st. So if the settlement happens on January 18th, who's in breach of contract? Now, is anybody in breach of contract? Can you close early? Sure, with agreement between the parties. So really, who's in breach of contract? No one. Why? Because we closed before, right? Yep. No problem.
Great question, I guess.
Yeah, that would be a good question. Practically speaking, you might not, you might want to avoid Mondays in practice, because trying to get something closed on Monday when people come in, drag it in the office at 10 o'clock on Monday morning, it might be a challenge. And remember, a lot of this, it's not the title companies sometimes they're dragging their feet, it's the lenders that have to send over all the contracts and everything else. And they're in, I mean, you have to realize that if you have West Coast lenders, they probably, it's 8 o'clock here or 9 o'clock here. They probably haven't even gone into the office yet, because they're, we're ahead of them in time. If they're East Coast lenders, maybe they've already been there a while, but then if you're trying to get something done in the late afternoon, they may be gone already. Now, normally lenders are pretty accommodating on working. If they're a national lender, they understand that they need to be more accommodating, but kind of look out for those. Now, I have a class on Agent's Guide to Settlement and how you fill out these forms and how you address some of these issues. And let me recommend that to you, because one of the things that you have to decide is when would be best for your buyer to close. Now, if you closed, the one I closed that recorded today, we actually signed the papers yesterday, and they were getting a loan. And so what will happen is the new lender will collect interest on the loan that they gave for them to buy the property for a few days to finish out the month of August, about 2 or 3 days. Okay. And then there will not be a September payment. Their first payment for these buyers will be in October 1st. because rents you pay in advance, but mortgage payments are paid in arrears. You're always paying for the month that was. Now, so if your buyer's really short of money, these were a couple of young kids and they'd saved up a grundle of money. They came to closing with about, almost $40,000, but that's unusual. Most people that are buying, or maybe they're trying to get an FHA or other low down payment type loan, and it's tight. Money's tight, so you want to close in at the end of the month. But there's a lot of upgrading buyers that have tremendous equities in their property, and you should close them, I believe, in the first of the month. Now they're going to have one whole, let's say they close in the 5th of this month, 5th of August. Well, they're going to pay a lot of interest on their new loan between the 5th of August and the end of August. But that's okay. They have a bunch of money in the bank. When they sold their last home, they walked away with $400,000. Okay. They could pay that. The cool thing is that they will have no house payment. For August, of course, they paid that interest up front, but there's no September payment. Okay. So their first payment won't even begin until October 1st. That means if they have a real job, they may have a paycheck on August 1st, August 15th, and then September 1st, September 15th, and then October 1st. My goodness, they have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 payroll payments before they even have a house payment. So if they've got big equity, that might be something to consider. And if you don't understand that, call me, we'll talk about it. Because there are strategies in putting these deals together. Also, title companies aren't busy the first of the month, and neither are the lenders. Especially on the 5th or 8th or so. Sometimes there's carryover because they didn't get things done by the end of the last month. But it's a much more pleasant environment to close in. All right, let's look at the next one, please, Daniel. If the buyer finds out the roof is leaking and needed repair, and they cancel on 12/28, who gets the earnest money? Okay, well, let's look at the page 6 of our real estate purchase contract and see when our due diligence deadline is. Our due diligence deadline is the 21st or 31st of December. They're canceling on the 28th of December. So what do you think, gang? Who gets the money? The buyer gets it back because they're canceling out. Okay, prior to the deadline. That's why you have a deadline. And I recommend putting some time in there, because if the market is brisk, a lot of things are happening, people are busy and whatnot. From a practical standpoint, folks, it's hard to get appraisers in. It's hard to get home inspectors in. There's a lot of problems and delays that can come up. So make sure there's plenty of time on these deadlines. And the people that can guide you on this, a lot of them are the lenders, because they're doing deals, multiple deals every month. And they know, man, it's really hard to get the appraisals back. Underwriting's all booked up. So they can give you some ideas. Okay. We really appreciate you being with us tonight. I'd like to leave you with a quick little quote. These are some of my favorite Forbes epigrams. And some persons fall into a fortune, but nobody ever yet fell into success. Success entails climbing. You don't fall into it, you climb into it. Yes, this is a tremendous business with phenomenal opportunity, but it's also going to take some effort. We appreciate you being with us today. Do well, do good, bless lives, and make some money, okay? Thank you for being here with us. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, Rick. Great stuff. Appreciate it.